All right, sorry about that. I started this little section and then had to end the video. So we're talking about cactus and succulent propagation. Um, Cactus and succulents all have specialized leaves that are, you know, you usually don't see leaves on cactus and succulents. You see spines and maybe tiny leaves. Those are the modifications that this group of plants has made to the leaves and the leaf structures on it in an effort through adaptation to the environment, a dry environment. Leaves are the place where water is lost, right? Through the stomata, you have transpiration. So the plant can take in CO2 through the leaves, but it also loses a lot of water. So in these dry climates, desert climates, where cactus and succulents exist, they have over time and evolved to have very small leaves or no leaves at all as a way to conserve water. So just going over some of the basic characteristics of cactus and succulents as an intro to how you propagate them. They have thick water retaining stems. A lot of them are epiphytic, not all of them. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. The bromeliad group is one that is probably the best known. If you ever heard of a bromeliad, those grow attached to other plants. And a lot of them are tropical, but even though there's a lot of water in the tropics, if you're a plant that grows on the branch of another plant, you don't have roots in the soil, you can't absorb water, so they are also adapted to these dry areas too, or water, scarce areas like a branch of a tree. Cactus and succulents have swollen roots, stems, and leaves. And there are also species from other families that are that are in this kind of greater succulent area. I mean, succulents really is the bigger category. Cactus are within that. So, but cactus are one of the biggest groups of succulents. But also ice plants, agaves, and yuccas. There's lots of different types of succulents. Euphorbs, including Christmas cactus, poinsettias. Those are all um, they're all in this group we're talking about because they all have thick succulent stems, and for that reason they have a special propagation technique. So techniques for cuttings are similar to other perennials, except cactus cuttings don't wilt. They're big and sturdy and full of water. Because they're full of water, they rot easily, and you can take often suckers or offsets or tubers from succulents, or think of an agave. It grows, and then from the base of the plant around the edge, new little plants start to grow out, little baby agaves that you can break off and plant separately. Those are called offsets. Um, Not so different than suckers, but you can get little new plants growing off the mature one. Grafting techniques are also well developed for cacti. Those are just for fun. They sell pretty well. And seeds, you can always use seeds to propagate cactus, but they grow slowly, and they're inexpensive to get, but they grow very slowly. I don't For most cactus and succulents, propagation of them by seed for like your business is not the way to go. Cuttings is the way to go. Much faster. Just break off pieces of the mother plant and get them to form roots for cactus and succulents. There's a little baby cactus that germinated from a seed. I have done plenty of germination of cacti from seed, and it's fun to see this little teeny thing suddenly germinate and produce this little succulent stem. It's kind of neat. It grows up a little bit more, turns into a regular small plant. Succulent cuttings are best done when they're ripe or semi-ripe, so you don't want the really new growing tissue. It's too tender and succulent. Usually something that's getting a little more mature, that's the ripe or semi-ripe tissue. Little, not necessarily turning brown because succulents don't do that so much, but just maybe last year's stem tissue would be best, or at least 6 months ago, not the really new growth. The wetter the younger the tissue is, usually the more succulent and water containing it is, and then also the more apt it is to rot. Use a very sharp sterilized knife Even more important with succulents because the wound is going to be big. Succulent stems tend to be very large. So you usually have a big wet wound, and to reduce the surface area using a sharp tool is even more important to reduce pathogen entrance into that stem. Some leaf cuttings you can just pull off leaves and of the mother plant and plant those. So this is probably the most unique aspect of succulent cutting is you take your cuttings, and unlike perennials, other types of perennials, you like, let's say you're doing lavender, that's different than this. Lavender is not a succulent, but you would just take the cuttings and put them right into the media in a moist, warm, well ventilated environment. But if you're doing succulents, you would take the cuttings, cut them off of the mother plant, and then put them in a cool, dry area for like a week or so. You let that surface, that cut surface, dry up and form what's called a callus. It's kind of like a scab on that wet area. So you're not taking a big wet stem wound and shoving it into soil. You're letting it dry over first. That's called forming a callus. These columnar cacti on the left they were cut off the mother plant, they were set to dry and form a callus, then put into media, and a few weeks later roots formed off of them. Cactus media is going to be a little different than the ones we were talking about before, in the sense that it needs to be very well drained, because that's what cactus and succulents are used to. They don't like water sitting on their roots for very long. Usually, to achieve that, you're adding or you're buying a mix that has a fair amount of sand in it. Gritty cactus soil mix with fine grit on top can be used. If you do buy a bag of cactus mix like there's this picture of here, it's going to be expensive, but it will be something that has a high amount of sand or perlite for good drainage, and some organic matter like peat that retains water. You'd want to insert the cutting deep enough to support it. As you know, a lot of these succulent stems and then the cuttings are pretty bulky, so the media has to be strong enough to hold them up. That's what that means when I say use gritty cactus soil mix with fine grit on top. So you could use kind of a regular potting soil which has a lot of good sand in it, and stick your succulent cutting in, but then you could put something kind of like gravel or grit, another like an inch on top of that, just as a thing to physically hold up that stem. And that kind of finishes off propagation of plants. Real kind of quick overview. But if this kind of interests you, has inspired you, excited you at all, please talk to me more about taking our plant propagation class, which is usually offered in the spring of every year. Really fun class. Uh, in, to end this lecture, I will talk about greenhouse design. That relates to plant propagation, but we do also talk about that in the full-length class in more detail. Different types of structures that are part of the overall greenhouse structure. We don't really have to memorize all this. Just kind of wanted to give you a feel for actually when you are designing a greenhouse, you have quite a bit that goes into it. It's a simple structure, but there's still quite a different levels of thought that have to go into constructing it so it serves the purpose of giving the plants what they need inside. This is the greenhouse that we have in this department. Although this is an old picture, it's actually twice that size now. And it's plastic sided. It's a type of plastic, polyethylene, that lets most light through. It's got vents on top. It has horizontal roof support. Those are called the purlins that come all the way down to the ground that kind of hold those panels of plastic in between. The ridge is the top roof line pole. You can see the vents up at the top where the roof is opened up a little bit. And shutters are on either end to allow airflow. And inside there are fans to move the air around, and what's called a swamp cooler to keep it wet or humid in there. Different styles of greenhouses, the designs. The upper left one, the Quonset, is pretty popular, especially for row crops, like just even in big fields. You're seeing more and more of those in um, covering over like berry fields around Southern California, especially around Santa Barbara. Like Camarillo, I see a lot of these, and a little bit up north too, towards Los Alamos. Those are really nice. They do provide protection from too much sunlight, and if it gets too hot, but they also, the shape of them allows a lot of sunlight in. Then these other greenhouse sizes, shapes, are for different reasons, and some of it is to reflect more light or absorb more light. If you're in a hot climate like around here, you want the design and the angle of the walls of the greenhouse to be situated or positioned so they reflect more light, take not as much light goes into them. But if you're in a cold climate where you need more light to get in, you would position them more at a 90-degree angle to the sun's rays so they absorb more of that light. So those are the reasonings beside how you choose which style. Some of it is, you want it to look a certain way, but if you're doing this for production for like a business, you're not really thinking about the beauty of the greenhouse. You're thinking about the functionality. An even span greenhouse is pretty much just a symmetrical one with even supporting beams coming out from the ridge line, equidistant on either side. A couple other examples. Again, the sawtooth, again, the Quonset on the bottom is a rounded structure, and that's made so that you can stretch sheets of plastic over it kind of continuously. And again, that has really good light absorption. And this is not a picture from around here. This is from the Midwest. So this is a place where during the winter, that's the main challenge of keeping it warm in there. And this would get maximum light absorption when it is sunny on winter days. The top, the sawtooth, these are very often used in industrial greenhouse situations where you can build one and then add another one on, and they're kind of modular. And the roofs are usually, the angled side of the roof is facing the sun. The sun, the like in this climate, northern hemisphere, those would be facing south to get the maximum amount of sunlight. Again, what I said to you before, the closer the degree of incidence, that's the angle at which the sun's rays hit something, the closer that degree of incidence is to 90 degrees, the hotter that object will get, meaning the more of the sun's rays and energy will be absorbed. So in number one, the roof is situated so it reflects light. It's not a 90-degree angle the way the sun's rays hit that. And this would be chosen to reflect light, whereas the walls of that greenhouse are closer to 90. So some of the greenhouse would absorb the light, but the roof reflects a lot. This would be one that, like around here, it's in a hot climate where you don't really need to get the greenhouse interior a lot hotter. Our greenhouse here on campus is not exactly this shape, but we almost never turn our heater on. And in a day, even a cool day when it's about 70 degrees, it'll be 100 degrees in the greenhouse here because we just have so much sun. Number two, again, the side walls of this one are angled even get more sunlight and energy into the greenhouse. It's even more close to a 90-degree angle. So that's really maximizing the temperatures inside to have the walls angling out a bit. The roof is still the same as number one, reflecting a majority of the sun's light. Number four, just another way to do it, you could have part of the roof being angled toward the sun, part being so a lot is reflected, and then little side walls on the bottom. I'm not really sure. I think there was a number three in here, but I didn't add it, so it just says one, two, four. But number four has a little bit of vertical wall, just because when you walk into that greenhouse, it makes it a little bit more of a usable space. You can have benches on either side with plants on top of it. You don't have to kind of lean over as you go towards the wall like you would have to in number two. It has the benefits of absorbing a lot of light, but without the awkwardness of almost an A-frame like you see in number two. And again, orientation of that actual greenhouse is going to be important too. So if you have a long, rectangular greenhouse, if you want to maximize sun exposure and more light into it, you would face the long ways towards, you'd face it east-west, here in the northern hemisphere, because you'd want the southern side to be facing the sun. If you want to decrease the amount of sun going into it, you would face it north-south. So the short end of the greenhouse is getting the most of the sun. So you're minimizing the amount of the greenhouse that's exposed to the hotter part of the sun's rays. And in fact, our greenhouse here on campus is facing north-south. So just the width of it faces south, where the hottest sun's rays come from. So we're trying to minimize that because it gets so warm inside there so quickly already. This is putting into text some of the things I already explained in the previous pictures. You can read through those, check those out. This one's an overall good shape, except for a little awkwardness in having angled side walls. This is another one. Here's number three. And this is another one you could do. And this one looks like it might not be bad if you're trying to reduce the amount of light on a south-facing slope. And like I said before, this is kind of a compromise of all of those shapes. These are just some examples to illustrate the point about how the sun's angle of incidence affects the temperature inside the greenhouse, and different things you can do to control that temperature inside. A lot of greenhouses like ours, we have a cooling system, and that's on often from spring through fall, but the heating system is not on very often, and it could be different in different areas how much you're using heating and cooling, but usually the greenhouses have both systems. So greenhouses can be made of glass, polyethylene, or polyvinyl chloride, which is PVC, like irrigation piping. Glass has its benefits because it is very durable in the sense that it lasts a long time, and it's durable, but it's fragile and expensive, but it looks good too. So those are some pros and cons. Polyethylene is less expensive than glass, doesn't look as nice, but these are these plastic sheets, so they're flexible. You can get this really thick kind of plastic and lay it over your hoop house or your Quonset shaped greenhouse, and easy to replace. Doesn't last as long, doesn't look as nice, but it's quite inexpensive. Polyvinyl chloride is more of the rigid, clear plastic material used in building a greenhouse, and it's a little more expensive than polyethylene plastic sheets. It's less expensive than glass. It does last longer than polyethylene, but does not last longer than glass. So there's just different variants on it. So now I've discussed a little bit about the design of greenhouses, and talked about succulent propagation and perennial propagation and seed and annual propagation to wrap up the lecture on plant propagation.